Så då kör vi, Andrew.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here. Jag vill säga först att jag ska köra på engelska. Jag kan prata svenska, men jag är inte så bra på jobbsvenska. Jag tror att kanske jag behöver lite längre än 30 minuter att försöka förklara framtiden. Men tack för det. And I also want to say that I'm from New Zealand. So if I have a strange accent, I appreciate your patience in listening. I'll do my best to try not to go too fast. So thank you all. Let's start heading into the future. So what I want to do today is kind of take you through an approach to thinking about how we can use imagination, storytelling, narratives for thinking a bit more further into the future about how we can transform the food system. What is it like to have your job in 30 years? How much will it change, both for you personally and in the society around you? And a lot of this comes down to the fact that the context in which we are all living has changed. We have now entered the Anthropocene. The idea and the fact that we've in a new geological epoch where human activity has become the dominant influence on climate and the environment. And on the one hand, this is terrifying. This is the fact that we are having an impact on the entire Earth system. And at the same time, it's also empowering because we are in the driving seat. And if we want the future to look different, if we want to challenge the direction it's going, then it's up to us collectively as humans to do so. Now, of course, if we've entered this new epoch where we are in the driving seat, it means that we also have to change the way we think about this world that we have changed. So we're in this human epoch, and what does that mean? And I like to share this quote from Johan Rockström, where he points out that in 50 years, we've tipped from this 10,000-year stable state where most of human development happened into the Anthropocene. And we're in truly, not exaggerating, a critical juncture for humanity, where what we do in the next 50 years is likely to determine the next 10,000, which means that a future perspective and getting away from sort of the preoccupations of the everyday is critically important. And this brings us to the role of storytelling. Stories are powerful things, and they can create our reality as much as they explain it. These futures that we envision, whether they're positive or ones of collapse or more dystopian, make us much more likely to respond to events in a world that creates that future. So the stories that we tell ourselves and the stories that other people tell us about our future are critically important. And a lot of scientific scenarios and a lot of kind of trend spotting where you look at right now what things are emerging sort of miss that both the story that we're telling and often make a lot of assumptions and have a lot of biases, and they also don't push us. We get stuck with this tyranny of the plausible. Well, that doesn't seem possible right now. But if anything about the world that we live in right now, not to mention human history, tells us, is that the impossible often becomes possible in a way that can be brutally difficult to deal with when we're living through it. Imagination is something that has traditionally been consigned to children, something that we grow out of. But what I want to do is to make the case that imagination is a really, really powerful tool that we have in our toolbox. When we're caught in everyday challenges, in the fact that so many of the structures or the ways in which we work feel like they're stuck and are never going to change, imagination gives us pathways out of that. And spending time in the future can open up new solutions and new possibilities. And science fiction complements imagination. It's an activation of our human imagination, and in many ways is about exploring how does the human condition respond to so many different kinds of futures. Many people associate science fiction with focusing on technology, but often it's the human's interaction with the technology operating in an entirely new world that really is why it has value. And so during my PhD, I applied imagination and science fiction to the future of the ocean. And today, I'm going to lead you into a couple of contrasting futures that are really relevant for the food system. So as we go on that journey together, I'm going to present an image, I'm going to take you through a future, and then we're going to spend a little bit of time reflecting on that, and then our time's going to be up. But I hope that you leave this Congress with everything you've gone through the last 2 days. The world is changing really fast, and we need to think differently about it. And I mean, your role as dietitians, you're so connected to so many people, to some of the most personal and important decisions of their lives. And we know that what we eat is critical, and we know that what we eat and the food system is one of the things that's most strongly connected to all of the changes that we're facing, whether those are environmental, technological, socioeconomic. You're at the center of this kind of movement towards the future. And that's what I hope to provoke and to give you some tools for thinking about it. Because of course, the idea is if we can feel more comfortable being in the future, if we can build futures literacy, we can help to anticipate where things might be going, see signals that right now are invisible, make them visible, and then react, come up with different kinds of solutions, and hopefully lead to system transformation. And so just to package this together, when I use kind of storytelling and narratives, I use them in the context of scenarios. And I see those as coherent, internally consistent, and plausible descriptions of a potential future trajectory of a system. Note what I'm not doing is the scenarios I'm going to bring you into are not going to they're not predictions. They are not the future. They are possible kinds of futures that have elements of truth. They have things that are quite certain and other things that are radically uncertain. They're designed to provoke and to help us to learn this process of living in the future. And so, to summarize, we can use imagination to think our way towards a better future. And that doesn't have to mean that the futures we create have to all be positive, but we can combine the positive and the more negative elements and actually take action in the present to lead us to a better future. And the way I've done that is through a method called science fiction prototyping. So today, in my remaining time, I'm going to take you into those two futures. One is called the hothouse without coffee, and the other one is called Wild City. So strap in and get into your time machines and prepare to travel to the future. The world right now feels tense, turbulent, without precedent, shifting under our feet. Many things that we thought to be predictable, like not having a war in Europe, are revealing themselves to be anything but. I want you to hold on to that feeling as we fling ourselves around 30 years into the future. The world is even more volatile, less predictable. Things that were formerly stable shift like quicksand. Scientists have today confirmed what we all feared has now happened. The Amazon rainforest is becoming drier and has begun its irreversible shift to becoming a grassland. Using a combination of satellite technology, on-the-ground observers, and research drones, as well as many years of accumulated data, we can now say with certainty that the Amazon is dying and will become something new, but it will never again be what it was. World governments are struggling to respond, and researchers from around the world are being consulted on the implications. Where did this start? Arctic sea ice loss is amplifying regional warming, and this warming in the Arctic and the melting of the Greenland ice sheet are driving an influx of fresh water into the North Atlantic. This has slowed down the Atlantic Ocean circulation system, a key part of global heat and salt transport by the oceans. The situation has gotten worse as rapid melting of the Greenland ice sheet and further slowdown of the regional ocean circulation has begun to destabilize the West African monsoon, triggering drought in Africa's Sahel region. And this slowdown in ocean circulation has, in combination with intense human pressures, dried out the Amazon rainforest and begun to disrupt not only the West African monsoon, but the East Asian one also. In the Amazon rainforest itself, enabled by a long period of uninterrupted populist rule, indigenous groups have been pushed violently aside, and frantic exploitation continues even faster in a vast land rush in the dying Amazon, rushing it even faster towards death as season after season of intense wildfires clear more and more forest and soy monocultures expand. It is no longer the rainforest that can be seen from space, but the enormous, ragged tracts of land that have been cut to grow monocultures of soybeans to feed a world that has pivoted towards a plant-based diet, but in a way that does not take account of the impact on ecosystems. The drying out of the Amazon is a tragedy for many, and like many things, an opportunity for a select few to become extremely wealthy. Unfortunately, the change in the Amazon rainforest is only one of a number of cascading shifts that are occurring as we approach ecosystem tipping points and our planet becomes hotter, drier, and weirder. The Amazon is part of an entire coupled system that generates water and sends it to other places thousands of miles away. With the Amazon drying, rain patterns start wobbling. And as noted, the West African monsoon stutters and becomes highly volatile and unpredictable. In many parts of the world, the viability of rain-fed agriculture and the delivery of ecosystem services collapses. And the people who relied on agricultural livelihoods must migrate. Millions move. Countries struggle. This time, though, as we have seen in the case of Ukraine, compassion and the power of the human spirit overcomes xenophobia. Sweden may be about to lose its beloved coffee, but it is about to gain hundreds and thousands of new co-citizens from around the world. The world reconfigures and flexes and shuffles as it goes through a beautiful, sometimes tragic dance of change and adaptation. In ecosystems, entire populations of different species of fish, birds, and insects are moving to where it's cooler. Iceland has become a fishing superpower as fish that used to spawn in the Atlantic have moved rapidly northwards. Entire biomes are shifting in response to climate as deserts grow and the Great Green Wall in the Sahel can no longer hold back the sands. Other species, too slow to adapt to the rapidly shifting climate, die, and there is a spike in extinction rates and biodiversity loss. In this increasingly hot and dry world, on the beginning of a path towards a hothouse Earth state, this is ripe for the emergence of even more new diseases and the migration of existing pathogens to new areas. First, bananas are struck down, and even Lord Cavendish can't save them, followed by coffee and then cocoa. The globalized food system changes shape, and each year the availability of food items from around the world differs hugely, making it an extremely difficult job for dietitians. The food system struggles to adapt. As the envelope of climate habitability shifts, the day comes when grapes can be grown in Sweden, when climate resilient crops replace plantation forests plagued by forest fires. Much of the world becomes a tinderbox, hyper fragile to the slightest disturbance, but changing too slowly. We find our way to living more of us closer together in a wider world, in a warmer world. In a rather ironic twist, as the Western world buckles, much of East Africa and parts of West Africa have confederated and have been able to leverage their much longer term experience living in a warmer world and have become the innovation engine for hothouse Earth. What little coffee still remains in the wealthy areas of Lagos and Kinshasa and Nairobi. Deep under the Sahara and much of North Africa, discovered in the early 2020s, was more than 100 times previous estimates of annual renewable freshwater resources in Africa. So, in a time when much of the planet was getting drier and freshwater resources coming under more strain, the African continent becomes a water superpower and a source of not only water, but knowledge and ideas, and yes, horrendously expensive coffee. So before I move into the next scenario, I just want to say that this is, again, not something that will necessarily happen, but I think that it's something that is going to, I mean, we're already seeing now with the war in Ukraine that there is another food crisis approaching. There's huge volatility in a lot of staple crops, and a lot of the wheat that it comes from Ukraine and Russia goes to many of the poorest countries. And when you combine that with climate, you start to create these really volatile conditions, which you could see could feed back to the way that we try to think about our national food systems, how we operate with human health, and all of these things start to come together in really unexpected ways. Interesting things about the Ukrainian situation was the fact that Ukraine provides about 75% of the world's sunflower oil, and sunflower oil is one of the major ingredients in plant-based alternatives to meat products. So a lot of the different kind of plant-based meatballs and those kinds of things have sunflower oil in them. So suddenly you have this shift happening towards what some people would argue is a healthier diet, although I realize that some of it is quite highly processed, but that's happening where suddenly one of the key ingredients is in massive scarcity. So this is taking a bit of a wild case and pushing it forward in the future. But you can see when you start to combine this more imagination-led approach with how things might change with what we're seeing on the ground now, it can actually act a little bit like a narrative simulation to try to play in that space and get sense of the volatility and try to plan for what happens if this kind of uncertain future comes towards us even faster than it already is. So with that brief break in the present, we're going to get back into our time machines and travel forward again in time to a different future. So once again, strap in, please put up your tray tables and prepare to travel again into the future. But before I do that, I just wanted to quickly show you also that when I read this narrative to you, it actually has a number of scientific papers that underpin it, which we sort of clustered together that make up the different elements. So I'm not going to go through this in detail, but one of them is climate tipping elements. Another one is the idea of systemic risk, and this idea that when we have a risk in one area, it can cascade and create different kinds of risks in different places. The fact that humans are going to be able to live on less of the planet, and then that puts a huge amount of pressure on the places that are still desirable for human habitation. And finally, that the way we think about water in a warming world is going to have to change, and there's some quite unexpected dynamics that underpin the way that we think about water, which of course is directly related to food. So, traveling again into the future. Art and beauty is not frivolous, but essential. Diversity, nature-based design, mushrooms, and the imagining of post-fossil fuel city life. These are the building blocks of the network of cities that are beginning to offer genuine alternatives to the way people have lived as humanity continues to urbanize at a rapid pace. The wild city is both very familiar and wildly different. Mycelium, so networks of mushrooms, became both a design philosophy about how to think and begin to build cities as deeply connected organisms, and as a new material, a fundamental building block, construction material, packaging material, and more. The first nodes in the network of networks are Taipei, Singapore, Curitiba in Brazil, and Detroit. The network has grown from there and expanded with 2 cities in Scandinavia beginning to be transformed. These cities are characterized by high density, a combination of accidental, emergent design, and deliberate biomimetic design that copies nature, reliable public services, and a collective effort to build or enhance high social cohesion. The Wild City Network stands above the first world and is a source of inspiration, a place of creativity and experimentation. The interweaving of art, architecture, anarchistic governance experiments, culture, alternate knowledge systems, aesthetics, ecosystems, and food production are reflected in the design of cities and green spaces and green infrastructure. And this is evident in the presence of vertical forests and design informed by nature, and a function that cuts across socioeconomic divides. In the landscapes immediately beyond the agricultural zones ringing the wild city, a massive project of rewilding has been taking place. A space for ecosystems to rebuild in new ways and provide a diverse range of ecosystem services, such as pollination, water, carbon sequestration for the cities, and this helps them to export, to stop them from exporting environmental damage to other places. The wild city aims to be a closed, regenerative system as much as possible. And this rewilding process has been led by Indigenous community trusts, formed into stewardship corporations, and this has happened through the more wide introduction of environmental personhood. This started off in New Zealand, where forests and rivers were granted personhood. And it's maybe about time that nature has the same status as corporations, which are also people. And this granting of environmental personhood brings nature more into the conversation when we're deciding how we make decisions about the future. Newly imagined food markets in the wild city become central. Augmented reality is introduced, and as the eyes of the wild city citizen consumer rests on a food item, the story behind it is told in vivid detail. A window opens into the lives of the people who produce the food, the conditions of the ecosystems that produce it, and much else. If one is brave enough to turn in the direction of cheap meat, the horror of the slaughter, the tight-packed animals, the blood-soaked hands, the acrid smell of the viscera, it assaults the senses. They quickly turn away. In fact, cheap meat is one of the first things to disappear as a result of this virtual cultural mashup and mixing of experiences, pleasure and trauma, serenity and terror, unfairness and beauty, despair and hope. A melting down of the rural-urban divide begins, and the elevation of the principle of biocultural diversity and equity or fairness end up governing the design and operation of food systems connected to the wild city. Indigenous and local knowledge and practices are fused with new advances in robotics, drones, and artificial intelligence to create an emergent agroecological system that means farmers transform into kind of like a hybrid of nature steward and software engineer, living in the city, growing food outside the city limits, contributing to the regeneration of ecosystems. In the future, we're not one thing, we're many. The wild city is a creative engine of regeneration that's able to challenge, provoke, and push change at the national level. From space, wild cities resemble the pistil of a flower with the petals blooming outwards as diverse agroecological landscapes. Diversity, modularity, and having backups become guiding principles for managing societies and ecosystems together in a few distinct places around the world. There is a collective realization that finding a better balance between humans and ecosystems requires addressing all forms of inequality and injustice. The wild cities become nodes of potential in a rapidly shifting world. The wild city is in stark contrast to the model of urban development that still predominates, the smart city. Fleets of autonomous vehicles, optimized with algorithms, running over rivers of concrete, which separate isolated, segregated, socioeconomically homogeneous areas of the city, pushing up against each other in tension, growing ever larger, sprawling ever further, still dependent on fossil fuels. The pattern of historic urbanization is a political force in itself. While the wild city, through the interweaving of green space, is able to regulate its own temperature, smart cities get warmer and warmer. They attempt to push back the rising waters of sea level rise, not through restoration of wetlands or mangroves, but with building larger walls, all the time getting hotter and needing to take more from elsewhere, degrading ecosystems further and further away to fuel their rapid growth. The creative energy of these cities is squandered on doing the same thing over and over again in urban design and hoping the result will turn out differently. The smart city is not so smart after all, as it amounts to trying to optimize a fundamentally flawed system. These places retain the stark divide between human and nature, urban and rural, and continue to perpetuate systemic inequalities and move further away from principles of fairness and diversity. In the future, as these distinct approaches stand in stark relief, the waxing of one and the waning of the other will determine the trajectory of humans beyond 2050. So I think that future is not, so far we can see elements of both of those kinds of cities in our cities today. But I think that there's going to have to be a lot of decisions as to whether we continue to do something. I mean, so much of urban design, of the design of our food systems, are based on kind of a fossil fuel based industrial system. And we know that we need to shift to something else. So again, when we can take the space to spend time in the future and imagine how things might be different, rather than getting stuck in the limitations and the constraints of today, that can provide a lot of value. So this isn't just about telling stories or trying to escape our reality. It's about creating space to simulate alternatives, to create alternate possibility spaces. And as I run out of time, we're back in the present, and I just want to share some key takeaways. That's an important thing to remember. So the value of these imaginative, fictional approaches is not in the false promise of predicting the future, which is pretty much impossible, even for the best scientific model. I mean, we know that like IPCC climate models can predict certain elements of climate change, but they can't predict how humans are going to respond. They can't predict the intersection between technology and ecosystems and socioeconomics. They can't predict maybe in the future the role that dietitians will have in helping us to shift the food system. They can predict a very narrow group of things, but there's so much else that we need imagination and storytelling to get us there. So this is really much more about engaging with a set of plausible and complex futures. And when certain trends in social, economic, and ecological systems express themselves, individuals, institutions like your own, and us collectively can read these signs, interpret them, and act. And in cases where anticipation of change that is fundamentally nonlinear is impossible, this approach can contribute through the creation of, as I said, alternative possibility spaces, types of narrative simulation, a way to experiment with and learn from the many potential surprising situations and shifts that might occur in the future. Imagining these diverse futures can reveal unseen pathways and can inspire human ingenuity, can come up with entirely different categories of solutions, while also highlighting the limitations of what we can do as humans in a complex world. Science fiction itself is a useful source of insight and ideas for developing scenarios of the future, and it can help us point out biases, absurdities, and highlight things that we take for granted in contemporary society. So by way of my final word, as you end this Congress, sit down with a piece of paper and tell a story about your future. How might the world look in 30 years time? And actually give yourself the space to do that. And you might be surprised what value it creates. Thank you.